So welcome, everyone. My name is Dale Bugin. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Canadian Climate Institute, and I'm really pleased to welcome you today to this presentation and this webinar on a report that the Climate Institute recently released called Prepare or Repair. And that report is taking a close look at how municipally and publicly owned infrastructure is vulnerable to climate risks and how proactivity can make huge differences in managing that risk. So, really happy to get into that later today. I want to start off by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, that is now known as Ottawa. And obviously, lots of you are coming from lots of different traditional territories across the country today. And there are similarities and there are differences across those territories. I think it's really notable that the issues Indigenous nations are facing are not always exactly the same issues when it comes to climate risk. The Climate Institute right now has new research underway exploring risks for Indigenous communities. So that sits in parallel to what we're going to talk about today, but I think it's a useful thing for us all to keep in mind as well. Okay, a little bit of housekeeping to get things going, and then we will get into the content. I know you're all anxious. So I do want to thank the Insurance Bureau of Canada, Climate Proof Canada, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, all of whom helped support this work and made this independent research possible. We appreciate that support and those partners in helping us do this work. The Climate Institute produces, I would say, Canada's top independent research on climate policy. And we do that by trying to work closely with people and organizations who are really on the ground and experiencing some of those impacts in a direct way. For those of you looking for simultaneous translation to French, pour nos invités francophones, nous vous proposons de suivre le webinaire avec une interprétation simultanée en français. Cette option est disponible pour les participants qui se connectent via un ordinateur ou l'application mobile Zoom. Pour accéder à l'audio en français, cliquez sur le bouton plus situé dans la barre d'outils principale au bas de votre fenêtre Zoom, puis sélectionnez Interprétation, puis Français. Vous pouvez également choisir de couper le son de l'audio d'origine si vous le souhaitez. Notez que l'audio en français n'est pas disponible pour les personnes qui se connectent par téléphone. Vous pouvez poser questions en français ou anglais. Posez votre question, utilisez la fonctionnalité question-réponse dans le bas de votre écran. So back to English. Happy to have all this in French and English. We'll take questions in either languages. If you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Okay, logistics over. Really pleased to introduce Patty Cuttle, who's the Deputy Mayor of Halifax Regional Municipality and Chair of FCM's Environment and Sustainable Development Committee to help get us going today. Thank you all, and thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Dale. Bonjour, bon après-midi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very happy to join you for today's webinar from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people. Here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, we are all treaty people. In addition to my role on Halifax City Council, I serve on the board of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which represents approximately 2,000 communities of all sizes across the country and serves as the national voice of municipalities. I'm also proud to serve as the chair of FCM's Environmental Issues and Sustainable Development Committee. The mandate of that committee is to facilitate detailed debate and provide FCM's board of directors with recommendations on policy and program guidance related to the environment. For example, at our last committee meeting, we discussed issues as diverse as forestry, pesticides, invasive species, and climate misinformation. Our committee members work hard to make sure these important issues get the scrutiny they need so we can make informed decisions on FCM's board. Adapting municipal infrastructure to account for a changing climate is one of the main issues we focus on. Municipal infrastructure is Canada's economic background. We need resilient infrastructure that protects households, businesses, and communities from climate threats. This report, Prepare or Repair, as issued by the Canadian Climate Institute, provides us with a critical insight into the importance of climate adaptation. It makes very clear preparing now rather than repairing later is the most cost-effective approach to climate adaptation. Proactive and early investment in adopting public infrastructure will immediately begin to produce between 4 to 9 billion in savings per year and greatly reduce pressure on municipal budgets. Local governments know that we need to adapt our infrastructure to the increasing impacts of climate change. This report underlines the urgent need to do that now. To outline how FCM has been doing its part to incorporate the report's findings into our advocacy, I'll hand it now to Louise Wallace-Richmond, our committee's vice chair and councillor for Salmon Arm, BC. Merci. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks, Patty. Good morning, everyone from beautiful BC. I will be offering my remarks in both French and English. So, FCM's Environmental Issues and Sustainable Development Committee has the ultimate goal of spurring real action. A good example of this is our leveraging of this new report. On February 26th, I presented to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development as part of their study on protecting Canadians from extreme weather. At this meeting, I highlighted to committee members from all federal parties the main findings of this report. The message was that adapting our local infrastructure in advance is, by a country mile, the most cost-effective approach to protecting all our communities. Aging public infrastructure simply makes Canadians more vulnerable, leaving communities prone to extreme weather events that can potentially halt manufacturing and trade, disrupt supply chains, cut off transportation and power, close schools and hospitals. That is why FCM continues to recommend an immediate investment of $2 billion in municipal infrastructure renewal, strengthen climate hazard mapping, and ensuring the most vulnerable communities and infrastructure is prioritized. Au cours de cette présentation, nous avons également souligné la nécessité de mieux soutenir les professionnels locaux de la gestion des urgences en matière de formation ainsi que d'équipement, d'apporter un soutien aux personnes évacuées et aux communautés d'accueil et d'assurer une meilleure coordination nationale de la gestion des urgences. J'ai également souligné la nécessité de mieux soutenir les communautés dans leur reconstruction après une catastrophe. C'est essentiel pour qu'elles puissent se reconstruire rapidement et être plus résilients dans l'avenir. Enfin, j'ai expliqué comment le Fonds municipal vert de FCM aide de manière proactive les municipalités à entreprendre des évaluations des risques climatiques, à élaborer des plans d'adaptation et à intégrer la résilience dans la gestion des actifs. The Green Municipal Fund can and must be further leveraged to protect communities in the years to come. This is just one example of our ongoing climate adaptation advocacy work. For more, I strongly encourage each of you to join us at FCM's upcoming conference in Edmonton in the first week of June. We'll have a packed schedule, including plenty of sessions and workshops focused on environmental issues, including those focused on protecting communities from climate change. With that, I'll hand it back to Ryan for the presentation of this important research done in this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise and Patty, for that really important introduction. I'm Ryan Ness. I'm the Director of the Adaptation Research Team at the Canadian Climate Institute. I'll be leading the presentation of our research today. And my colleague, Zach Carriere, our research associate on the adaptation team, will be guiding the group afterwards through the question and answer session and moderating that. You can ask your questions, as was said, using the Q&A function of Zoom at any time. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en utilisant la fonction questions-réponses de Zoom. And you can ask questions également en français ou en anglais. You have the options to ask questions anonymously or to attribute them to yourself in particular. Please feel free to use either option, and we'll start answering questions immediately upon conclusion of the presentation. I should note as well, this presentation reflects recent updates to the modeling behind the Prepare or Repair report that came with the final technical report from our partner consultant. These do not materially affect the overall findings of the analysis, but they do result in some modifications to some of the specific cost and benefit numbers that were calculated. Further detail on the specific updates can be found on the Prepare or Repair page of the Canadian Climate Institute website, which has been provided to you. So thank you again for joining us for this presentation and conversation. Prepare or Repair is the Canadian Climate Institute's report that presents the findings of our recent research on the costs of climate impacts on public infrastructure and the costs and benefits of proactively adapting that infrastructure to a changing climate. I worked on this report, as did Zach and our colleague Vivian Gower, who is not on camera, but who is here behind the scenes today as well. So thank you to them both. We developed this work as an independent research project with the support of IBC, FCM, and the Climate Proof Canada Coalition, based on a mutual desire across those organizations to refresh the national conversation about the scale of action, investment, and adaptation that are required across the country to prepare infrastructure for climate change. Understanding the costs of climate impacts and supporting the economic case for proactive climate change adaptation has been and will continue to be a major strategic priority for the Canadian Climate Institute. So we were pleased to take this work on. The technical analysis, as Dale indicated, and the production of the report were made possible through funding from IBC, FCM, and Climate Proof Canada, alongside an in-kind contribution of dedicated Canadian Climate Institute research staff time. All of the partners mentioned agreed that this report should focus on the benefits of adapting Canada's public infrastructure, which, as Patty and Louise have highlighted, is vital to life in Canada. It underpins trade, commerce, and daily life. It's primarily owned and operated by local governments and is being profoundly impacted by climate change. I will share my screen. And start to get into the meat of our analysis. The context, as we all understand, is that climate change is already showing up in many ways across Canada that are related to infrastructure and the work of public agencies that own and operate it. Floods are more frequent and intense, heat waves are lasting longer, and wildfire seasons are stretching further and further each year. These events aren't just a reflection of environmental change, although that's important and dramatic, but they're also impacting Canadian society, daily life, local economies, public finances. One of the less visible but most important consequences is what climate change is doing to public infrastructure. Much of what we rely on every day, roads, sewers, water, and wastewater treatment systems, was built for a very different climate. And this, importantly, isn't just about big one-off disasters that result in immediate catastrophic infrastructure damage and destruction. And in fact, our analysis focuses on almost the opposite, the day-to-day climate stress that changes like more heat and more heavy rain are causing. They gradually shorten asset life and drive up maintenance and replacement needs. Asphalt and concrete wear more quickly. Water and wastewater systems face temperature stresses they weren't designed to operate under. Buildings, public buildings, need more frequent maintenance and repair. And over time, that's making infrastructure more expensive to operate and harder for governments to maintain in a state of good repair, and leaving more of it in a fragile condition where it is more prone to failure, creating a positive feedback loop as climate change continues to stress it more and more. And as been mentioned already, when infrastructure fails, the consequences spread quickly. The impacts are felt well beyond the costs to the government that owns the infrastructure and has to fix it. Transportation is disrupted, essential services are interrupted, supply chains are affected, and economic activity slows down. So that's the core challenge this report is trying to surface, that there are huge societal benefits to adapting infrastructure and to keep it and the people and businesses and communities that rely on it functioning properly. But despite strong evidence that adaptation pays off, investment continues to lag behind what's needed, so governments need to do more. An important part of the story is that the climate change is not hitting us already strong, resilient infrastructure system. In fact, Canada is starting from a position of infrastructure weakness. For decades, investment in public infrastructure hasn't kept pace with population growth, with inflation, or with the aging of assets over time. Maintenance has been deferred, renewal has been postponed, and responsibilities have been gradually downloaded to municipalities without matching fiscal capacity or authority. So the result is that we have a large stock of infrastructure that is older, less reliable, and more expensive to operate than it otherwise should be. Many infrastructure systems and assets are now operating at or beyond their intended design life. And when maintenance and replacement continues to be delayed, costs don't just accumulate, they escalate. What could have been a relatively modest rehabilitation becomes a much more expensive rebuild after failure. In some cases, that can multiply costs by an order of magnitude. So this legacy really matters when it comes to growing climate risk. Aging infrastructure is less resilient, more fragile, more vulnerable to extreme heat, heavy rainfall, or freeze-thaw cycles. Each new climate shock accelerates the rate of deterioration and adds to future repair costs. So climate change, infrastructure degradation is not a new stress. It's a risk multiplier that's amplifying existing weaknesses in our infrastructure system. But this also, if looking at it on the flip side, creates a window of opportunity. If we take the opportunity to renew aging assets, governments and public infrastructure owners can embed climate resilience into the new assets or renewed assets, reducing future damage and vulnerability and breaking the cycle of deferred maintenance and emergency repair that's being accelerated by climate change. So our analysis zeroes in on heat and heavy rainfall for a practical reason. They're two of the most important and widespread ways climate change affects infrastructure performance across Canada. Gradually rising temperatures and more frequent and intense rainfall don't generally cause sudden and headline-grabbing failures. Instead, they quietly accelerate wear and tear, shortening the lifespan of roads, bridges, and water systems, and driving up long-term maintenance and replacement costs. That makes them particularly well suited to the type of deterioration-based modeling that we used in this study. Other climate hazards absolutely matter. Wildfire, permafrost thaw, coastal erosion, drought, flooding, all pose serious risks to infrastructure themselves. But many of those hazards don't fit neatly into deterioration models, either because their impacts are sudden and highly variable, or because the data needed to project them consistently at a national scale isn't there just yet. So the results you see here should be understood as a conservative slice of the overall problem. They capture two of the most important everyday system-wide stresses that climate change puts on public infrastructure, but not the full range of climate hazards Canada will need to adapt to over time. As we'll talk about later, we do look at the additional challenges and investment needs that flooding may cost using a different type of analysis, looking at the scale and potential benefits of flood protection investments in new flood protection infrastructure, which we will get back to. For the analysis, we worked with the engineering and consulting firm WSP using models that they developed, many of them with the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario, who's really been a leading authority in the assessment of climate change in this way. And those models explicitly simulate the process of climate-driven infrastructure degradation, how assets age under sort of normal climate conditions, or those of sort of the historic climate in Canada, but also how climate change stress accelerates deterioration, and through simulating the pace of deterioration of infrastructure shows when that deterioration crosses thresholds that will require intervention, whether maintenance, renewal, or replacement. These physical changes are linked to costs of those interventions, so that shifts in temperature and precipitation can be translated into changes in maintenance and capital spending over time. We use that model to look then at costs, how costs evolve with climate change under different choices about adaptation. So we modeled a baseline no adaptation climate change scenario, but we also looked at outcomes for a reactive adaptation pathway and a proactive adaptation pathway, which I'll explain shortly, and then showing how each of those types of choices affect both the amount and predictability of future infrastructure spending. It's again important to capture and be clear about what these results do and don't highlight or estimate. The core analysis, as I said, focuses on two primary climate stressors, increasing heat and heavy rainfall, because they can be robustly modeled using the deterioration model, as well as the fact that they are a primary driver of infrastructure for degradation. But as a result, we need to understand that the cost estimates should be understood as conservative that come out of this analysis. In reality, the full range of climate impacts on public infrastructure is very likely to drive higher long-term costs than those shown in the analysis when thinking about infrastructure degradation and replacement. Just as importantly, though, the model doesn't capture many of the broader economic benefits of adaptation. It doesn't fully account for the avoidance of business interruption, of reduced losses to households and families, the benefits of stronger regional economies, or improved insurability when infrastructure performs reliably under stress. So again, these results that it will show represent a lower bound, both on the costs of climate change for infrastructure, as well as the benefits of adaptation. Even so, the approach that we use provides what we think is a credible and important picture of the size of the challenge and the scale of the opportunity for adapting Canada's public infrastructure. So before adding climate change into the picture, I'll just pause on the baseline. Even in a stable climate, maintaining Canada's public infrastructure in a state of good repair is a massive fiscal undertaking. Our modeling shows that simply renewing and maintaining infrastructure without accounting for any additional climate stress will cost about $112 billion per year across the entire national portfolio of assets. Municipal governments account for the majority of that spending, roughly $81 billion annually, reflecting their majority ownership of core public infrastructure systems, with the provincial government accounting for most of the remainder, or with provincial governments accounting for most of the remainder. But the point here isn't just the size of the number, it's that this spending is largely unavoidable. Governments can defer maintenance only for a time, but they can't opt out eventually of maintaining essential infrastructure without risking service failures and much higher costs down the road. So these baseline costs set the context for what will follow. Climate change isn't just creating a new spending challenge, it's layering an additional pressure on top of an existing ongoing fiscal challenge. So this slide shows what happens when climate change is layered onto that already large baseline. Even with responsible asset management, moving towards maintaining infrastructure in a state of good repair, rising temperatures and more frequent extreme rainfall will accelerate infrastructure wear and shorten the lifespans of assets. Under a no adaptation scenario, those physical effects have already, in the near term, added about $9 billion per year in infrastructure costs compared to the late 20th, early 21st century. By mid-century, that figure rises to roughly $14 billion annually, and by late century, nearly $20 billion per year, which gives an average of about $15 per year, $15 billion per year from now until the year 2100, as shown on this graph. On average, about 75% or 70% of these climate change-driven infrastructure costs without adaptation will fall on municipalities, reflecting again a concentration of their ownership of key assets. And this graph shows where the analysis shows the divergence of long-term cost implications across different adaptation pathways. So climate change drives up infrastructure costs in every scenario, but how governments respond makes a huge difference to the long-term average cost. A proactive approach where infrastructure is upgraded for climate resilience at the first major rehabilitation point that provides an opportunity, even if that's before it reaches the end of its useful life, this approach delivers the lowest overall costs over time. Compared to doing nothing, proactive adaptation reduces average annual infrastructure costs by about $9 billion per year over the rest of the century, even when accounting for, and in that bar on the right, is the cost of that proactive adaptation, as well as residual climate damage, which we'll talk about a bit more. It outperforms a reactive approach where assets are only upgraded at the point of replacement by roughly $4 billion per year. And the reason is pretty straightforward for this. Acting early prevents assets from deteriorating in the most costly conditions, which reduces the need for big, expensive repairs and extends the effective life of expensive critical infrastructure systems. So it's not just a defensive approach, it's a way to get ahead of climate change and lower lifetime infrastructure costs. Whether those savings show up and are realized, however, depends on how public infrastructure owners evaluate costs and benefits over time. If decisions are made by short-term budgets, the value of acting early is easy to miss. When you compare what governments invest in adaptation with what they avoid paying later, it does clearly pay off across all types of infrastructure, even with very conservative accounting assumptions. We find that proactive adaptation delivers more in avoided future costs than it requires in upfront investment, even when it's evaluated using conservative assumptions. The governments and infrastructure owners sometimes apply quite high discount rates when assessing the value of investments in infrastructure, which places much less value on benefits that occur further into the future. However, even under a very conservative discount rate of 8%, we find that proactive adaptation still delivers net benefits, delivers benefit cost ratios greater than 1 for every asset type. When using lower discount rates that more realistically reflect intergenerational issues around the performance and reliability of long-lived infrastructure, benefit cost ratios jump dramatically to many to 1. So the returns show up even when projects are assessed even under the most rigorous financial lenses governments and public infrastructure owners might apply. And again, this is just in terms of avoided infrastructure costs. So it tells us that the barrier to proactive adaptation shouldn't be that it's perceived to have weak economics. The fundamentals of the investment case are very strong. The challenge, which we'll come back to, is how risks, costs, and benefits are distributed across time and across different actors, and how that leads to incentives or lack thereof to invest in adaptation proactively. Another way to think about the benefits of proactive adaptation is in terms of how risk accumulates or is reduced over time across Canada's entire infrastructure portfolio. With proactive adaptation, each renewal or major rehabilitation is an opportunity to reduce exposure to future climate hazards and add resilience that steadily shifts the overall asset stock towards a resilient condition. By the 2050s, our analysis shows that a proactive approach would bring well over 2/3 of public infrastructure assets up to climate resilient standards. A reactive approach tells a very different story. If assets are only upgraded when they fail or reach the end of their life, the vulnerability remains embedded in the infrastructure system much longer. Even by late century, a reactive approach would still leave a large share of infrastructure exposed to worsening climate risks, which would then potentially become the source of greater fiscal shocks as infrastructure fails more suddenly and more often as climate change impacts increase. So the point here is that early action changes the trajectory. It more quickly reduces the number of vulnerable assets in the system, lowers the likelihood of disruption, and creates much greater fiscal stability. It is important to be clear that proactive adaptation does not eliminate climate change-driven infrastructure costs. Acting early does lower long-term costs and avoids the most expensive outcomes, but it still requires sustained investment. Adapting infrastructure to rising heat and heavy rainfall means governments need to start investing immediately, about $2 to $3 billion per year at first, and maintain that effort over time, averaging roughly $4 billion per year over the rest of the century. But even with that investment, total infrastructure spending will continue to rise as climate change will intensify stresses on both new and old infrastructure alike. But under a proactive pathway, the combined costs of investing in adaptation and dealing with the remaining climate change related damage are controlled to about $6.5 billion per year, about a 5% increase relative to spending with a no climate change baseline. That is substantially lower than the cost governments would face under reactive or no adaptation approaches, which defer spending at first, but ultimately lead to much higher and more volatile bills. As I mentioned earlier, while this analysis focuses primarily on adapting infrastructure to and adapting existing public infrastructure to rising heat and heavier rainfall, those aren't the only risks, of course, that communities are facing across the country. Flooding in particular poses an escalating threat along Canada's coasts and rivers, not just to public infrastructure, but to homes, businesses, and essential community services. Managing that risk will require more than just strengthening the infrastructure that we already have. In many cases, it will require the construction of large-scale protective infrastructure like dikes, seawalls, and floodwalls, and the elevation of vulnerable buildings and structures. So to illustrate the scale of what that might entail, our analysis includes a high-level estimate of the costs and benefits of structural flood protection measures across the country. These measures were only simulated where the value of avoided flood damages in terms of reduced damage to public and private buildings would produce a positive benefit cost ratio or a benefit cost ratio greater than 1. So the results show that, like other forms of proactive adaptation that we just talked about, flood protection can deliver strong returns and big savings as well. Near-term investments of roughly $2.5 billion per year through 2040 could reduce average flood damages to public and private buildings alone by more than $3 billion per year for the entire remainder of the century. So the key message here is that effective proactive adaptation has to go beyond just upgrading existing public infrastructure assets. It will also require upfront investments in other types of infrastructure. Another important source of uncertainty and risk is how much the climate ultimately changes. The results we've talked about so far are based on a middle-of-the-road greenhouse gas emissions pathway where global emissions peak around mid-century and then start to decline. Roughly the trajectory the world now appears to be on in the 2 to 3 degrees of warming frame. But when we look at higher emissions pathways, the picture changes significantly. In a hotter, higher emissions scenario where humanity struggles to get greenhouse gas emissions under control, infrastructure adaptation and the required investments would rise well beyond the median estimates in the medium emissions scenario, which is what's been discussed here, potentially several times higher. In contrast, lower emissions pathways substantially limit future damage and would reduce the scale of adaptation needed to keep infrastructure functional and reliable. So the key takeaway here is that adaptation and global greenhouse gas emissions are tightly linked. Strong global greenhouse gas emissions reductions wouldn't eliminate the need to adapt, but they would make the adaptation challenge far more manageable. And on the flip side, a lack of success in reducing emissions will dramatically increase the scale of the adaptation challenge. As I noted earlier, there are many benefits of adaptation and costs of not adapting that don't show up cleanly on public infrastructure owner and government balance sheets. When infrastructure performs well under climate stress, the benefits extend far beyond the costs that would be avoided for the owners on maintenance and replacement. Reliable roads, water systems, transit, power networks all reduce business interruption. They keep supply chains moving, and they prevent knock-on losses that can ripple across local, regional, and the entire national economy. For households, resilient infrastructure means fewer service disruptions, less property damage, lower exposure to health and safety risks, and faster recovery after extreme events. For businesses, it means less downtime, more predictable operating conditions, and lower indirect losses, business losses when climate impacts do occur. These benefits also matter for the financial sector and the insurance industry. Fewer infrastructure failures reduce the likelihood of correlated private property losses, large spikes in claims, and the cascading impacts that are straining insurance markets around the world and challenging insurability in high-risk areas. None of these effects are fully captured in our modeling in this study. In practice, if you were to account for avoided business interruption, reduced household losses, improved economic stability, stronger insurability, the true value of early proactive infrastructure adaptation is almost certainly much, much larger than what we can quantify here. And that's why adaptation is ultimately a shared challenge, because it's the governments who own infrastructure that pay first, but the benefits are widely dispersed and shared. So our analysis makes it clear that climate change poses a long-term risk to Canada's public infrastructure, and one that no single order of government can manage alone. Infrastructure decisions that we make today will shape resilience for generations, but the current set of incentives and resources available to infrastructure owners don't reflect the full social and economic value of proactive adaptation, and therefore it's not happening as quickly as it should, even given the clear value proposition. Public infrastructure benefits all of Canadian society, but the governments that own it and maintain it only capture a small portion of the returns from acting proactively. Many of the larger benefits flow to other actors, households, businesses, insurers, other orders of government. And so this disconnect between who pays and who benefits creates a collective underinvestment problem, even though, again, that the economic case for adaptation is strong. So we make a series of recommendations focused on overcoming these structural barriers so that climate resilience is embedded into infrastructure planning, financing, and management across all orders of government moving forward. First of these recommendations is to address the most immediate barrier to proactive adaptation, which is financing. Municipalities own most public infrastructure in Canada, but their primary revenue tools, property taxes, development charges, were never designed to finance large, long-lived infrastructure renewal at the scale that is now required. Indigenous governments face even greater barriers in some cases in accessing capital because of dysfunction in federal funding frameworks and constraints under the Indian Act. Addressing this gap requires coordinated financing approaches that reflect the fact that we all share the risk and we all share the returns across Canada and across all orders of government. So senior governments, the federal, provincial, and territorial governments can play a critical role by expanding infrastructure programs for resilience and establishing predictable multi-year funds, and aligning cost-sharing formulas with the distribution of benefits. We also point to the need for potentially new financing tools especially for municipal governments, like pooled financing models, borrowing and financing guarantees, bond mechanisms, and value capture mechanisms at the local level that help those infrastructure owners invest early. But financing is not alone if climate risk isn't built into infrastructure decisions that are being made every day. Climate-informed asset management is one of the most effective tools governments have at their disposal to reduce these long-term costs and incorporate proactive adaptation. However, despite clear benefits, climate-informed asset management is not the norm across Canada. Many public infrastructure owners' asset management plans still assume historic conditions will continue into the future, or don't or can't take climate change into account. The capacity of different actors and governments to improve their asset management practices is not even, and the requirements and supports of senior governments to do so are often weak or inconsistent. So mainstreaming climate adaptation into asset management will drive proactive adaptation forward. Effective asset management and adaptation planning when it comes to infrastructure require data that is accurate, accessible, and usable about what the future climate looks like, what the hazards that will deteriorate and degrade infrastructure look like. Canada still lacks most of the information that is required. Where data does exist, it's often fragmented, it's difficult to access, or it's held in the private sector domain, which is often too expensive, especially for smaller governments. So we highlight the need for a coordinated national effort to strengthen Canada's hazard data foundations through shared and transparent data sharing platforms, national standards, and open access initiatives. Many infrastructure assets in Canada are still being designed using historic climate assumptions, which means that we are actually adding to our stock of climate vulnerable infrastructure with each new project that does so. Modernizing codes and standards to reflect the future climate is among the most direct and high impact actions that the governments can take to reduce long-term infrastructure risk and keep from adding to the risk that we already have. This includes updating design parameters for rainfall and heat in the case of the hazards that we looked at, but also ensuring that professionals, engineers, planners, asset managers develop knowledge that keeps pace and allows them to implement that understanding. Governments are in that vein spending tens of billions of dollars each year on public infrastructure and on new public infrastructure or major renewals of existing infrastructure, but too much of that spending still risks locking in future climate vulnerability if that funding is not conditioned on ensuring that the new infrastructure is climate resilient. Climate resilience, therefore, needs to be a core condition of government public infrastructure funding, not just an optional add-on. This means requiring projects to show and applicants to show that the infrastructure they're proposing will perform and be resilient under future climate conditions. But it also means supporting applicants, especially smaller, rural, northern, and Indigenous communities, with the data and tools and capacity they need to meet those requirements. And finally, it's important to point out and highlight that both how climate change will play out across this country and the risks that it means for different areas, and the capacity that different infrastructure owners have to adapt is not evenly distributed. Again, smaller, rural, northern, and Indigenous communities often face both more exposure to climate change, but also fewer fiscal and technical resources to adapt. So target approaches are needed to identify hotspots of vulnerability like these across the country, as well as to prioritize critical assets all over in all types of communities, like water systems, hospitals, and transportation links that are vital, and integrate these into infrastructure planning and funding. So in conclusion, our analysis shows clearly that investing now to adapt Canada's public infrastructure is really essential to reduce long-term costs, but also to maintain reliability and protect quality of life and prosperity in the country. Every year that we delay increases future expenses and deepens future fiscal pressure. Proactive adaptation, which is guided by good data, by good planning, good asset management, and modernized design standards, offers a huge return on investment to governments and to all taxpayers and people and communities across the country. But realizing these benefits means that we have to recognize that adaptation can't be financed or delivered alone by individual infrastructure owners like municipalities, who often bear the upfront responsibility for all these damages. The benefits of resilient infrastructure flow well beyond community boundaries into regional economies of the national financial system, and again, all orders of government. So federal, provincial, territorial, municipal governments need to work together to collectively deliver infrastructure adaptation in a way that reflects the true shared benefits and shared risks, rather than concentrating the burden on the infrastructure owners, who are often the least able to absorb it. And we hope we provided Canadian governments of all orders with clear evidence and a playbook for action to move this forward. Thank you for your attention.